After World War II, in which both countries fought as allies, tensions between the US and Russia reached new heights. Americans had been wary of communism in the Soviet Union for a long time. For their part, the Soviets also didn't like how the US refused for decades to recognize the USSR. They also didn't like how the US took so long to join World War II, which caused tens of millions of Russians to die. These issues eventually turned into distrust, then hostility, and soon sparked even the Cold War. By the time World War II was over, most American leaders agreed that containment was the best way to stop the Soviets from expanding. George Kennan, a diplomat who lived from 1904 to 2005, explained the policy in his famous Long Telegram. He said that the Soviet Union was a political force fanatically convinced that there can be no permanent modus vivendi with the US. So long-term, patient but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansionist tendencies was the only choice for the US, and the next 40 years of foreign policy would be shaped by this way of thinking. The containment strategy also gave the US a reason to build up its military in a way that had never been done before. In particular, American leaders pushed for the development of atomic weapons, like the ones that helped end World War II, so began a dangerous arms race. In 1949, the Soviets tried out their own atom bomb. In response, President Truman said that the United States would build the hydrogen bomb, or superbomb, which would be even more powerful than the atomic bomb. Stalin did the same. Because of this, there was a lot at stake in the Cold War. The first aid bomb test, in the Marshall Islands Enuitak Atoll, showed how scary the nuclear age could be. It made a 25-square-mile fireball that blew a huge hole in the ocean floor and was strong enough to wipe out half of Manhattan. After that, tests done by the United States and the Soviet Union sent radioactive waste into the air. The constant threat of nuclear war had a big effect on everyday life in the United States as well. In their backyards, people built places to hide from bombs. In schools and other public places, they did attack drills. However, the whole scenario took another turn when space exploration became another battlefront for both superpowers. On October 4, 1957, a Soviet R-7 intercontinental ballistic missile launched Sputnik. Sputnik, the first artificial satellite and object made by humans to enter Earth's orbit. This surprised most Americans, but not in a good way. Space was a natural extension of America's long history of exploration, and it also was important not to lose too much ground to the Soviets. In addition, seeing how powerful the R-7 missile was and how it seemed to be able to deliver a nuclear warhead into U.S. airspace made it even more important to find out what the Soviet military was doing. In 1958, the U.S. Army, led by rocket scientist Wernher von Braun, launched its own satellite called Explorer 1. This started what became known as the space race. In the same year, President Dwight Eisenhower signed a public order that created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, dedicated to exploring space, and several programs that try to use space for military purposes. Still, the Soviets were one step ahead, and in April 1961, they sent the first person into space. In May of that year, after Alan Shepard became the first American to go into space, President John F. Kennedy made the bold public claim that the U.S. would land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Nonetheless, his prediction came true on July 20, 1969, when Neil Armstrong of NASA's Apollo 11 mission became the first man to set foot on the moon, effectively winning the space race for the Americans. The Cold War was also brought home by the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, starting in 1947. The committee started a series of hearings to show that communists were still trying to cause trouble in the United States. HUAC forced hundreds of people who worked in the movie business in Hollywood to give up their left-wing political beliefs and testify against each other. More than 500 jobs were lost and many writers, directors, actors, and others were blacklisted for more than 10 years. HUAC also said that State Department employees were doing things that were against the government. Soon, other anti-communist politicians, led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, 1908 to 1957, widened this investigation to include everyone who worked for the federal government. Thousands of federal workers were looked into, fired, and even charged with crimes. As this anti-communist hysteria spread through the 1950s, liberal college professors lost their jobs and loyalty oaths became commonplace. As worry about the Soviet threat grew, so did the fight against subversion at home. In June 1950, the North Korean People's Army invaded its neighbor to the south, which was backed by the West. This was the first military action of the Cold War. Many American officials worried that this was the start of a plan by communists to take over the world. Truman sent the U.S. military into Korea, but the war dragged on for a long time and ended in 1953 with no clear winner. In 1955, the United States and other NATO members accepted West Germany as a member and gave it permission to get its military back. The Soviets responded with the Warsaw Pact, an organization for mutual defense that included the Soviet Union, Albania, Poland, Romania, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. Soon after this, more international fights just seemed to follow. A U-2 spy plane over Cuba found nuclear missile sites under construction on October 14, 1962. Thinking of these missiles as an immediate threat, President Kennedy gathered senior officials to discuss the problem. ExCom met virtually daily for 2 weeks, and while some desired an invasion or airstrikes to remove the missiles, others wanted a negotiated settlement. Nonetheless, in the heat of the event, only 8 days later, Kennedy ordered a naval blockade of Cuba and DEFCON 3 for all U.S. forces. As Polaris submarines, B-52 bombers, and ICBMs were launched, the whole globe watched U.S.-Soviet tensions rise. Khrushchev alerted Warsaw Pact soldiers, and subsequently, U.S. forces went to DEFCON 2. In the meantime, U-2s continued flying over Cuba, and Russian officials warned frequently of undesirable results. Fortunately, Khrushchev announced the missile withdrawal on October 28, and at the same time, the U.S. secretly removed Turkey's Soviet-threatening missiles in the spring of 1963. Then in Vietnam, the fall of the French colonial government led to a fight between the nationalist Ngo Dinh Diem, who was backed by the U.S., and the communist nationalist Ho Chi Minh. Since the 1950s, the United States had kept an anti-communist government in the area, but in the early 1960s, it was clear to the leaders that if they wanted to contain communist expansionism, they would have to help Diem more. However, what was supposed to be a short military action turned into a war that lasted 10 years. President Richard Nixon changed the way the United States dealt with other countries almost as soon as he took office. He said that instead of seeing the world as hostile and bipolar, we should use diplomacy. To do this, he tried to get the UN to recognize the Communist Chinese government, and after a trip to China in 1972, he started to build diplomatic ties with Beijing. At the same time, he changed his policy towards the Soviet Union to be somewhat more relaxed. In 1972, he and the Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and this stopped the threat of nuclear war that had been around for decades. Nevertheless, the Cold War got worse again when Ronald Reagan took office. Reagan thought, like many other leaders of his time, that the spread of communism was a threat. So he helped anti-communist governments and rebel groups around the world. While Reagan was fighting communism, the Soviet Union was falling apart. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became premier of the USSR, and seeing the country's economy in bad shape, he introduced the Glasnost and Perestroika policies, which changed Russia's relationship with the rest of the world. By 1991, the Soviet Union had fully broken up, marking an end to the Cold War once and for all. This brings us to the end of this video. If you like the video, please consider subscribing and sharing so we can keep bringing more content like this. See you next time.